Well, welcome to FHIR Working Group meeting for today. I think we've got a few last minute, well, not last minute, um, a few last things to make it in before ballot. Um, I will just share the screen with the agenda and we can kick off. Cool. So I popped a link in the chat to the agenda for today, and I'm just going to zoom in. So this is a little bit more people friendly. These are the agenda items for today. Jamie's already let me know she's covering Dushi's items. Are there any amendments or additions that we need to make for this? Cool. Hearing nothing, I will just go to the first item on the agenda, approval of minutes from previous meeting. So just so you can see that they're here, we've got this is all of the agenda items, and then we've got our recording, our previous minutes. Looks like pretty thorough job with a bunch of actions as well. Has anyone got any amendments that they would like to make to these minutes? Hearing no amendments or additions, I'm happy to entertain a motion.
Danielle, I'm happy to motion approval of the minutes of the last call.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. Anyone to second?
Richard,
Here,
I'll second.
Richard.
Thanks, Richard. All right, just going to launch a poll for the approval of previous minutes. That's there. Cool. All right. So I can see we've got 9 and Brett in the chat. That's everyone who can vote. So, all right. So we have got 7 affirmative, 8 affirmative, including Brett, in the chat, 0 negative, and 2 abstentions. Previous minutes are approved. Motion carries. Can you tell that I have been out for a few days unwell? Awesome. All right. So next item on the agenda, we've just got a few updates from Brett to start with.
Got what I was going to say. Let's see. Oh, yes, we have a ballot open. For sign-ups, so don't forget to sign up if you haven't already.
Are you
I
able
think
to access the stats on that sign up? Like, where are we in terms of sign
I can
ups?
tell you. Amongst yourselves.
Thank
Yeah, so yes, so we're working towards doing the publications. So at the moment, we have 23 signed up for ballots,
Is that for base or core or both?
for both.
Okay. I know Cyro's only half signed up, so we'll have a few more from there.
Yeah.
And then I guess there'll be a bunch more people. I don't know if agency's
Mhm.
already signed up because I'm assuming agency will have a bunch.
They have started.
I think there's only a couple of us who've signed up yet, and we're waiting on final confirmation of the names of who'll get the 12 allocations, I think.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So we can probably expect a few more coming through from the agency.
Yeah,
So,
I would be surprised if we don't hit like 50 again, but I'll need to check with Department of Health and I guess some other people around that because I guess that's a question around Halo Connect. Do you guys have a membership? Are you guys signing
yeah,
up?
we do. So I've signed up and Paul has signed up, and I think we've got one more of our team members who needs to also sign up. So
Hmm.
that's our 3 allocations.
Hmm.
Um, so is there any, I think everyone else is well in process. Um, if you haven't, can you please sign up to ballot? We are balloting base and core. Um, so get involved. Um, awesome. Okay, thanks, Brett. So just the last part of that, just today is the last meeting for AFMM1 approvals to be included in ballot. So we've just got a few items related to that on the agenda today. Just so it's spoken and announced and stated. We've also had the IGs published for AU Base, so 6.11 draft, AU Core 2.10 draft, and then AU Patient Summary, Release 1, 1.0.0 working standard. Brett or Danielle, do you want to speak a little bit more to that at all?
Oh, only the draft publications were to support the Spark testing event trend last week.
Mm.
So that was good. We got that material out for that event, so that was excellent. And yeah, and the patient summary publication is the approved working standard for patient summary. So the first release of patient summary.
Which is wonderful. Awesome. Thanks, Brett. And then last item, Connectathon tickets are open. Danielle or Brett, again, did you want to speak to that at all?
Ooh, or Andy. Andy's on the line. Go for it, Andy. Tell us all about it. Oh no, he dropped. Oh my God.
He must have
Prescience.
heard you.
That question. Okay. So yes, Connectathon is out. Let's find the link
Yeah,
for
create
that.
the page.
Yeah, there's going to be a bunch of connected care. So there's like two sign-ups. There's a track preference sign up, and then there's a I actually want tickets to it that people need to fill out, and I do not have the links on me. We should put those in Zulip, to be quite frank, so that I can find them easily and then paste them into other
There's
meetings.
yeah,
Um,
there's a link
However,
now for that registration at least in
do
the.
you have the links, Brett? Can you find them and paste them in?
I've got yes, I can.
All right, cool. Because I think there's still spots. I don't actually know how full up we are yet. Um, but I'm very interested to see how we move forwards with connected care scenario. The track. I think that's going to be really, really interesting.
Mm. Especially after the preview um, at the testing event last week.
Yeah, because I thought that went pretty well, actually. To be quite clear, I thought that was pretty magic.
I think so too. For anyone who wasn't in the room, did you want to give a 1 minute spiel?
Yes. And do we have Michael Wilson on the line? Because I want the latest diagram. We do not. Oh, that's a shame. Okay, so we sort of prototyped out a bunch of different connected scenarios, and by connected we mean that we've been spending the last, I think, 3 years building out foundational pieces of um, interoperability across things like, AU Core and things around requesting, including things into like testing spaces. And so uh, there's a level of maturity now that I think a significant proportion of the community is at, quite a high kind of like market share level that is able to do the basics. Like we can create these things, we can share these things. Um, and we can potentially even update these things. But the reason we have these is to support particular consumer journeys and use cases. So the next step for us now is how do we tie all of these together? None of these are really meant to be in isolation. In fact, they're meant to work together to support use cases across the ecosystem. So we trialed out 5 particular test scenarios, including using information around scheduling appointments, things around supporting e-requesting with more complex information, things around doing reconciliation with patient summaries, for example. There was a whole bunch of different scenarios that we were trialing out, connecting 2, 3, 4 different foundational pieces that we'd been building together on that worked really well. We had tangible instances that were able to be demonstrated on the day for every single one of those things, including things where people just put it together on the day. That was pretty magic. And then the next step from this is coming into the Brisbane Connectathon to do the connected care scenario, which we a step even further from that. It's kind of putting every single one of those pieces together from a couple of Department of Health driven consumer journeys that are incredibly complex across the ecosystem and seeing how we can connect all of those. What are the things that we can just build out together on the day, and then also feeding into kind of like new projects. So yeah, that's my overall summary.
It's a pretty good one. So yeah, I second it was a really good event to just see everyone come together, especially the things that were changed or added or made new on the day. It was really cool. It'll be really interesting to see what happens going into this Connectathon. So tickets still open. Thanks, Brett, for the links in the chat. I think from there we can move on to, unless there are any other updates on news, we can move on to item number 3. So Jamie covering for Dushi.
Thanks, Marika. I'll share my screen if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay, just checking you can see the meeting minutes.
Yep.
On my screen. Yep. Just zoom in a bit. So I have a couple of items that I'll. Okay. Sorry. I don't know how I've done that. Okay. A couple of items that I'll present on behalf of Dushi. She's unwell, so wasn't able to join us this morning. A couple of items relating to the final checks for the preparation for publication of AU Core for ballot. So the first one is requesting endorsement for AFMM1 for the AU Core artifacts that we've just added in. So I'll bring up the ticket. So in the AU Core workgroup meeting last week, the group endorsed all of the new profiles as AFMM1. So I'll present what we went through in the meeting, and then we'll be looking to request endorsement from the FHIR work group for those same profiles. So so for the profiles, we're looking at AU Core composition, AU Core diagnostic report, AU Core document reference, AU Core endpoint, which has a little bit of a caveat, but I'll come back to that, and AU Core medication dispense. So for each of these new profiles, they fulfill the criteria for AFMM1 in that they are substantially complete and ready for testing and validation, which we've already at the test event kind of started that process. They also have 0 errors and 0 warnings for all profiles. So for AU Core endpoint, just a note on that. So the work group, the AU Core work group, conditionally endorsed AU Core endpoint because it's based on AU Base Endpoint, which hasn't yet been agreed as AFMM1. It was endorsement conditional on AU Base Endpoint becoming AFMM1. So if the FHIR work group is happy to do the same, conditionally approve or endorse AU Core endpoint going to AFMM1 if AU Base Endpoint goes to AFMM1, which will be, I think, next up to be discussed. I'll just quickly go to the QA report to show you that there are no errors or warnings. Where are we? – Okay, so we have For AU core composition, no errors or warnings. For diagnostic report, no errors or warnings. For endpoint, same. Medication dispense. And what have I missed?
Document reference.
Document reference, thank you. Also 0 errors and warnings. Any questions before I make a motion to endorse these as AFMM1? Okay, hearing nothing. I'd like to propose a motion that the FHIR work group endorse these new AU core profiles as AFMM1, noting that the AU core endpoint will be conditional on AU Base Endpoint going to AFMM1.
Thanks, Jamie. Anyone happy to second, including the conditional approval of endpoint?
Brett here, I'll second.
Thanks, Brett. All right, just launching a poll. We go. Cool. If you are unable to vote, can you either speak up or pop something in the chat? Got 80%. Oh, actually, we've got everyone who can. Brett, I think you're the only one who's not eligible to vote. Great, thank you. All right, just ending that poll. All right, so we have 9 affirmative, 0 negative, and 2 abstentions. The motion to move these particular items to AFMM1 has been approved. Cool. All right, on to the next item. So, Richard.
Oh, sorry, Marika, I'm not quite done. I have a few little bits to go through, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Sorry.
That's all good. So for the next part, in terms of prep for AU Core for ballot publication, I would like to run through a review of the QA report. There are no error, one error that we've previously accepted. Sorry, I'll just scroll back up to the top to see that. So just the one error that has been previously accepted, no warnings and no info. There is one new suppressed warning that I would like to review with the group and request endorsement or approval. So I'm so sorry, I can't scroll down any further, but it's this one down here, warning 13. So we have suppressed this warning and have discussed, and the AU Core work group agreed to suppress these warnings. So looking to request the same endorsement and approval from the FHIR work group to suppress this as well. These new warnings came from the endpoint examples. So they are example URLs, which you can see from the example.com within the URL itself. So this was agreed by the AU Core work group to suppress. During the meeting last week, it was agreed to change this URL from example.com.au to example.com. And once Dushi did that, for some reason, it's not appearing as a warning anymore. So this reads as 0 uses. So this can be removed. Basically this warning is just saying this URL doesn't resolve because it is an example. It's expected. And we already are suppressing similar warnings like in warning 9, where they're like example ABN or HPIO identifier system URLs. So and I also wanted to discuss, as with the AU Core work group was agreed to in future, or to agree in principle, I suppose, that any warnings that come from example URLs any warnings that come from example URLs can be suppressed going forward without explicit workgroup approval. Sorry, Danielle, I noticed your hands up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what you're proposing. I was wondering if so the warnings that are generated are largely controlled by the IG publisher toolchain. So it doesn't
Yes.
surprise me that once we've removed the .au, we no longer really have a warning around example.com, but we should raise and bring to the IG tooling group that meets every Wednesday to ask them about the other format because the one that's still throwing a warning is the MLLP rather
Mm-hmm.
than rather than the HTTPS. And I wonder if that's just not something that IG Publisher is recognizing yet as a prefix that's
It could
accepted.
it
So
could be the port as well. The port might be throwing it off even.
yeah, so I think
So
we should
yeah,
check
that'd be
with
cool to
them
go. Yeah.
because but yes, I totally agree that in principle anything that is correctly formatted as an example URL or URI, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
formatted according to like the international requirements of things with international domains, we should accept. And then just track through into like IG Publisher toolchain things to make sure that they're not throwing warnings where, it's just fully recognized ways to do examples.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Any other questions or comments before I make a motion? Okay, not hearing any. So I would like to propose a motion that we accept this new warning suppression, so warning 13, and going forward, accept that we will suppress any example URLs or URIs, as Danielle explained, that are correctly formatted, where we expect that they won't resolve because they are an example.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yep. On the one with 0 uses,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about removing that from this list. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Good. Yep. Fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. So we've got a motion from Jamie on the table. Would anyone on the call be willing to second?
Richard, I'll second it.
Thanks, Richard. Just launching the poll. Go. Once again, if you're unable to vote, please pop something in chat or speak up. Counting down 3, 2, 1. Thanks, Brett. All right, so we have got 8 affirmative, including 1 in the chat, 0 negative, 2 abstentions. Motion carries. Jamie, it looks like you've got one more item on your list.
Yes, please. So this one doesn't need to be voted on, but just presenting the AU variance statement from AU Core to the FHIR work group because there has been a change since it was last presented. So as was the case previously, there is no variance from AU Base, but we have added an additional AU Core document reference profile. So under this header of additionally profiled resources, this is a resource that doesn't currently exist in AU Base, so we are noting that it is in addition to or are not profiled in AU Base currently. So just, yeah, Danielle, I'm not sure if there's anything else that I need to do in terms of presenting that to the group. But
No, unless people would like to go into more detail. I mean, that's the only
sure.
change is of all the different profiles we've added into core, medication dispense has a base and we derive from it. Composition has a base profile and we derive from it. Diagnostic report has a base profile and we derive from it. So it is only document reference that's new that doesn't have a base profile, and we're not proposing it does. Oh, and sorry, endpoint. Endpoint from core will also derive from base endpoint. Um, so document reference is the only one where there's now a proposed profile in AU core, but there's no proposed profile in AU base. That's intentional. I'm happy to talk to that if people are interested. And that's why I guess we've updated this particular section in the variance statement to say, what other things have we profiled that aren't in base? And there's only one, and that's document reference. So I mean, it it does what it says.
Cool. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I think just from the previous point that we were talking to, Danielle raised a valid point saying we need to escalate the different URL format that was still raising an error to the appropriate publishing working group. Just wondering if we can note an action on someone so that that's followed up.
Happy to note it for me. Yes. Yep.
Oh,
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie.
Cool.
All right.
That's everything for me then. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jamie. All right. Richard, over to you. So talking about moving AU Base Endpoint and its terminology to AFMM1.
Okay, hi. I'm doing this for Uday, who's got a other commitment today and it's not working. I wonder if I can share. Let's see if I can share. Let's try sharing this screen. No, not that screen. Stop share. Sorry about this. Share. This one. Got it. Okay, right. So is that
Maybe I'm
by,
seeing this weird
by
blank desktop that looks like linen.
yeah. Have you got something you can see now? Is it big
Yes,
enough?
there's a tiny square of a Confluence page on the
Can
top
you?
left. That's bigger, and now you're so going to need to zoom in.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. Getting used to working with.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, I can read that.
Is that adequate or should I zoom more?
No, I'm all right with it.
Okay, right. Okay, so there's Jerry. Oops. Hang on, let's do the sharing differently. Stop share. Share. Window. Share. How's that? Does that work for people?
Should you perhaps zoom in a bit? That's better.
Okay. How's that?
Go one more zoom, just one more. Yeah, okay, that's better.
Thanks.
Okay, right. Okay. Jira issue was to take the AU Base Endpoint and its terminology resources to AFMM level 1. So we've got the particular resources are there's this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. So it's two code systems, two value sets, and a structure definition. They were previously at maturity level 0. They're now at maturity level 1. Their status has changed from draft to active. The work involved in doing it is described here. So we've got this profile, there's the value sets, there's the code system. As part of that work, well, basically that's all I did, and one little piece of cleanup that was involved. The input files had unused extensions, which were stripped out by the publisher, so I removed them from the input files. And that's that. What should we show you? We should probably show you the QA report, which I've got here somewhere. Well, I guess I can get to the QA report from here. Here's the, no, not the change log, the QA report. There it is, coming up. Here's the QA report. Okay, so there's a few errors that came up, but none of them are associated with the work I'm doing. So there's medication, stuff was all around. Here's endpoint. So they have an error about their OIDs. And from what I can gather, the OIDs are two things going on. One is the lack of OID is an error for HL7 international resources, which should only be a warning for our resources. And the validator is being changed or is going to be changed so that these no longer throw errors, they would throw warnings. The other thing is that HL7 Australia will assign OIDs to these after they get to AFMM level 1. So those two will go away when that happens. And then the next error, that's not one of these. Here's the value sets. The value sets have the same OID problem and an information. And then if we scroll down, and the code systems, for whatever reason, and the code system, there's the code system. So the code systems have that same OID problem. And that's it. Yes, Jamie.
Thanks, Richard. I'm just wanting to talk or ask a question really about payload type. So in looking at some examples of endpoint resources.
Are you thinking of, okay, yeah, you carry on, yeah.
I'm wondering if there has been a discussion with the broader community about the appropriateness of the codes in the value set that's bound to payload type. So I was looking at how to represent a FHIR RESTful endpoint, and I couldn't see a code that was appropriate for payload type. And I'm wondering if there's been a review of the codes that are contained, and if there's kind of a consensus on whether it's appropriate for use. Like I can't see a code in there for that, and I don't know if that's just my lack of understanding or yeah, but just want to see if there's been a broader discussion about the content.
Brett's got his hand up. Hopefully he can give an authoritative answer as opposed to my guest answer.
It's not so much of a authoritative answer. I think we're still, discovering what the best practice approach to doing this would be, and I think even further than that, we probably need discussion on how to profile endpoint for different uses. I think currently there is an endpoint example for Philip's question there that is for a RESTful FHIR endpoint. There was some movement on the payload type definition for that example. So I don't know, Richard, if you can click on I think it's example 1 attached to the.
Oh, example 1. Yep. I come up
Yeah.
here. Endpoint. No. Example 1. This one here.
No, the other one.
Oh, because that'll be example 0, right? Yep.
Yeah.
Because we count using C. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we check the you'll have to you're in the branch. So you want to be in the current build.
Oh, you've made some changes today, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean that's been merged in.
Yep. You pushed some changes after I did this. So profiles. No. Yeah, profiles. Endpoint.
Yeah. And I think
and it's the second example.
Yeah, so there was a switch to make the payload type any, and if we actually that is inside the value set. Currently the preferred value set.
Hang on. Let that value set go. somewhere up here, one of these is in fact the value set, which has had the value
Yeah.
any up before.
Yeah. And oh, that's our value set. I think you want the expanded set.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
There
There
we
should
go.
be
It's
a
this one
term
here.
D.
There it is.
Yeah. So the definition of that, it, it's and this is up for discussion, I think, on appropriate usage. But it's just the language in that that says it's either payload agnostic infrastructure or some other type of endpoint where payload considerations are internally handled. And with the capability statement on a FHIR RESTful endpoint, that would be applicable because the payload considerations are defined in the capability statement. Um, so they're discoverable, but you have to visit the endpoint to discover it. Yeah. So and I just yeah, so I applied that code to clean that up because I think the original example of specific resource types, I think that's very furry in as being a methodology to do fire RESTful endpoints. Um, and yeah, so I think this one is cleaner where you're not actually advertising specific resource types that's available in the capability statement. Because it's actually much more complicated than that, because obviously you can have different interaction capability as well as the resource payload types. So I think there needs to be a mechanism to describe that introduced, but I think that's not necessarily needs to be done here and now. The other point, the reason I sort of came to that as well is the US project for the provider directory kind of cleanup they're doing where they're bringing all the national provider directories together. There's actually a FHIR project there, and they've decided for FHIR RESTful endpoints to actually fix that payload type to not applicable as and they consider it. They're not advertising anything about the endpoint in terms of payload type. So that's another consideration where that's kind of some prior art and an actual approach to that. So I'll drop a link to that example as well, which is, and this is a current, oh, this is the wrong info. Let me drop that. Yeah, so this is a US project for the FAST, which is the Fire at Scale Task Force, which is yeah, they're doing the National Directory of Healthcare Providers in the US. Yeah, so I think that's probably a useful reference. They've also introduced a bunch of extensions which we might be interested in down the track, but I think yeah, there's some discussion to have. I see Danielle will want to say something.
I mean, I think my comment to a degree carries on from yours, in that, and I'll just, so what I put on the chat, I'll elaborate on, so it's there for the purpose of the recording, that um, what we've been testing out together in terms of sharing data has been really FHIR RESTful, and what we have currently defined in endpoint, both in core and base, doesn't tell you how to do FHIR RESTful. It doesn't describe, and I don't think the terminology covers it. And when we move into encounter record, and I think potentially where the agency is going around record locator service, it's not covering it either. So perhaps it is covering provider directory, which is one use case. But from a base and core perspective, I'm starting to feel that this is that we've got a long way to go, I think. around definition of terminology and around definition of the usage. And it becomes a difficult argument for us in the firework group, and we should discuss it openly around whether or not we say this is AFMM1 and why, on the basis that, yeah, on that particular basis, I guess is what I wanted to raise. Because also, I want real examples. Like, we are hitting endpoints, right? We are hitting endpoints in our testing as we go to every connectathon. We're connecting to Halo Connect and best practice. We've got Epic, we've got Oracle, we have the Spark FHIR server, we have all of those. Can we not actually agree on what would be an endpoint representation for that? And if we can't, I think we've really got a problem. That's what I wanted to throw out there.
Thanks, Danielle. Do you have anything to, I guess, reply to that, Richard?
No, not really.
Sorry, realizing I'm throwing you under the bus a little bit with Uday off.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I mean, one thing is it enough for what's here to be a foundation that other stuff can be added to later? So examples can be added later, and values in the value set can be added later, without undoing the work that is already here in terms of the existing set of values, the existing guidance, and the existing examples. So in that situation, you could say, yes, it's certainly not well finished, but it is good enough to start working with at an AU base level. Another possibility would be to say, no, when stuff's at an AU base level, we wanted to have a set of values in its terminology that covers the majority of use cases that we want to work with now. And we wanted to have a set of examples that cover an appreciable part of the use cases that we want to work with. So I think what we've got with AU Base, with this profile at the moment, is it meets that first description of adequacy for AU Base. It doesn't meet the second description of adequacy for AU Base. And I don't know where the community wants to sit on that, because my expectation, without having worked super close with this, is that it does meet the first criteria of being stuff that can be used, but it's not complete. But it doesn't meet the second one of being stuff that gives you good guidance across the breadth of its use.
Thanks, Richard. Noting that we have two hands, so we've got Jamie and Brett. Does anyone have anything that they would like to add to that thought? Because I would agree with you generally, Richard, that we're meeting the first criteria, but maybe not necessarily second, and we need to decide as a community, is meeting that first criteria enough to get it across the line to be AFFMM1? Would anyone else on the line like to comment? If not, I'll throw to Jamie.
I see your point, Richard, in that like perhaps this is a base that we can build from, but as an IG author, like I'm trying to figure out how to represent an example, and I don't know how to do that. And if it's unclear for me, then perhaps other people will experience the same thing, I guess is the point that I wanted to make. The other thing I wanted to say, Brett, to the use of, was it not applicable in the international example that you provided? Like, is that indicative that there's an appropriate code missing that needs to be like raised at a higher level?
I think it's more like they've chosen to add that code into the value set to directly represent data absence, which is a choice you can make, because they've applied the value set. My point was going to be more like, I think any or just a data extension would be appropriate for a FHIR endpoint for payload type, and you go and discover the actual capability at the endpoint. I think too, from some of the discussion from the HCA project, that's where people were thinking as well, a few others. But I think as well, like one of the things I raised for the HCA project was having a way to actually identify the capability from the endpoint, and that I think that would be IG or actor based. And that US project also has an extension to reference implementation guides and actors. It's their own custom extension to do that. So that's how they actually tell you what kind of fire endpoint is available. But you need to have a standard or a IG or an actor definition to describe that in a single entry or a code assigned to some capability. So they've got a set of things. Some of them are IHE profile references by code, and some of them are by implementation guide references directly with actor referencing as well. But that's like a whole bunch of discoverability use cases, right? That you want to actually have endpoints discoverable by those things. Whereas like the baseline is to just say there's a fire endpoint at the end of this, go and check what it does. Um, and I think like using any or a DAR for payload type is appropriate for a fire endpoint. So I think it's actually is usable. But like again, and that too is a specific use case. Like it's a use case of endpoint that's specific. So sure, we need to define one, but I don't think we necessarily need to do it. Um, I think the value set is adequate to um, fire endpoint location.
If this were on that theme, if this were to get across the line today in a motion to make it to ballot, would it be something that the community would be comfortable with, maybe raising the issues of better examples as a ballot issue, just as a way forward?
I'm happy for better examples to come up during ballot. I think that would be one of the things
I
we'd hope
think,
would happen.
but like we're at that point where it'll be a profile specific advice to say use payload type this way for this purpose. So, and like that's actually we would say that.
But
Um,
whatever else, we may be being too hung up on payload type. I think it's more what I wasn't particularly raising that it's all tied into the payload type element. It was for me, the connections and the endpoints and what we're trying to advertise of how do you get a patient summary off someone else, and if you want to expose that through an endpoint,
yeah, but it's a use
I
case.
don't know that our current terminology or guidance covers it. And
Oh, it
so
totally
that was
would because you
more what
just
I was
locate
raising.
you locate the fire endpoint and then you go and check capability that can do the operations you need to do the job.
Okay, so if we have no problem raising and defining what would be an endpoint definition for what the HL7AU reference server, then great. If we've already got that defined,
Sure.
including the terminology, then it covers that. And that's good, and we can expose that, and that will be helpful during our testing.
Yeah, and I think that I'm not saying this is the end of the road either because I think we need specific profiles for patterns of use. So like the secure messaging one was one done in the original PD project. So that was a specific pattern for secure messaging that said these extensions are appropriate, these terms are appropriate. Um, and I think we need to do something similar for fire. I think there's two layers. There's like the general fire endpoint location. So that's one where you can locate a fire endpoint, which I think is pretty, the example kind of shows that. And then you go and discover the rest of the capability. But I think there's a future project where we say, how do you actually define which specifications are implemented at this fire endpoint for discoverability purposes? But we would have to add an extension and we would have to, yeah, actually have a referencing system, whether that's actors or IG references or other coding referencing. But
So
that's
can we
like
have
specific, that's like a specific requirement that you would want
so
to be able to do that. Yeah,
can we have the exposed example that is the HL7AU reference fire server endpoint
sure.
and include that in base and we put that out to ballot? Like as part
Yeah.
of, because that's I think what I've been concerned about is that yeah, we're talking about PD, but base is not just PD. It's not a PD spec. It's much wider. So we need to be confident that we are covering the other use cases, which have been predominantly fire RESTful endpoints. So if we can put together the example for that, then I would be satisfied that we
Yeah,
have what we need that goes wider than just PD.
yeah. Honestly, it'd be very similar to the current endpoint example, except that it have the HL7 endpoint and HL7 organization details.
Cool.
So
Just
yeah,
cognizant of time, and we've gone now just a little bit over time for this item. Um, I think there's been some really, really valid and useful discussion today around examples and how do we use this and how do we apply this and what's the role of base and what's enough criteria. Given everything that's been discussed, I'm happy to entertain motions if there are motions to be made. If there aren't motions and then the things need to be amended or adjusted before they can be brought back, that's also an option. Just today is the last meeting for approvals for ballot. So
I'd like to suggest that maybe some of the inadequacies that have been ascribed to this profile are things that would perhaps be better in core rather than in base.
Not from
Given
a
that
terminology perspective, has to start. Base is
yes,
always wider.
that's it. Base has got the terminology. Yeah. Okay.
all right, so Richard, this is your item. Would you like to make a motion?
Yes. Let's make a motion that that um, that these 5 resources be accepted as being at AFMM level 1 and go out to ballot, with the expectation that during ballot, better examples will be provided. That's it.
All right, thanks, Richard. So noting that as part of this motion, we're also accepting those errors that should be warnings when that has changed in the tooling. Is there anyone on the line who would like to second this motion or make any friendly amendments?
Brett, I'll second it.
Okay, thanks, Brett. All right, so just launching the poll. Cool. All right, so just noting everyone who can vote has voted. If you can't vote, please drop something in the chat. I'll count you down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. All right. So we have got 7 affirmative and 5 abstentions with 0 negative votes. So motion carries to include this in base, expecting some amendments and feedback in ballot. Thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone for some really productive discussion. It's really important that we capture that. All right, Richard, over to you for the AU Provider Directory project scope statement.
Hang on. Got to find where my. Hang on. I thought that was the end of what I had.
Yeah, that's me. That's Ricardo.
Sorry, I got wires crossed. Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, Richard.
No, that's all good. I'll just share my screen.
Just before we jump into this, the next item is Angus. Is there anyone on the line who's representing Angus, or is that item, I guess, going to be deferred?
We can try to message Angus, but I don't think I see
don't think-
anyone who would rep Angus.
I also am concerned we won't have time.
I'll DM him and see what happens.
Cool. Just noting if he did join the call, there's probably not time for the full discussion and probably only be 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how long this takes. All right, thanks. Over to you, Ricardo.
No, not a problem. Look, I'll make this one relatively quick because it's something that we brought to this group already. But what I just wanted to do quickly with everybody first is just a kind of a flip the page exercise, so you can see the small changes we've made to this PSS, and then I guess we'll talk about next steps. So after suggestions from Danielle, so we've made a few amendments, including to the project title that's now been adjusted to reflect what it's been known as previously in the HL7 register. We've also, and I'll just keep scrolling down, we've also made some changes here to the product, sorry, not the product info. Yeah, so to the product info section. So we had AU Core here listed incorrectly previously, so we've updated this to just reflect that we're actually updating an existing IG, the AUPD, so we still don't have a target release for this one, and that would be something that I'll be keen to discuss with this group. And the last change that we made to the version that was previously submitted was the inclusion of the two additional supporting organizations, Health Direct and the department, who both confirmed their supporting organizational role in this project. Other than that, the PSS has really just remind what's been submitted previously, and I'll be keen now to have a discussion with this group in terms of next steps and in terms of target release date for us to try to schedule this work in here at the agency. So if anyone's got any thoughts, any suggestions, anything think would be useful for us to reflect or to try to kind of pursue, just yeah, please let me know. But yeah, that was really it, I guess, as a starting point.
We have a question from Danielle.
I've got a couple of comments. So, I mean, okay, so prefacing is a matter of order. We can't approve it until the fields that have been highlighted are complete. So let's try to get them complete in this meeting. I think your first potential valid target release would be the next one for AU Core, whatever we wrote in that one. Just checking, Brett, that's not ballot cycle, that's publication cycle, yeah. So that would be Q1 2027, assuming you went as fast as you possibly could.
Yeah.
That would be your earliest possible, and that means you're balloting in August as a ballot for working standards.
This coming August.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Your next ballot possibility would
Let's strike
be
that out.
yeah, so your next ballot possibility would then be the following March cycle, which
Yeah.
means the publication cycle for that is, I think we think of it as Q2, but it's usually the first week of actually Q3, but who cares? We could write Q2.
Yeah.
So it's like the last
Okay.
week of June, first week of July. That would be your next opportunity. And then otherwise you just push out the years because we've only got two ballot cycles. So you want to kind of target it for like the ballot cycle and then when's your earliest kind of publication from that. So yeah, that might be your
Yeah. So
better one.
I think this is good. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Danielle.
No worries. And then we've got the other two. What are the other two ones? Okay, so you need HealthLink's approval to list them. I don't know if we have anyone from HealthLink on the line, but you could absolutely get their okay, yes, that they're happy to be listed as supported org if you don't have it already.
I
Um,
believe they were at the call when this was previously presented, and I assume that's the reason why they were left in there.
mhm.
But I'll double check. I'll double check with them.
I think otherwise, I think it's looking like, I'm assuming Department of Health, yeah. So it is just double checking Health Direct's cool to be listed as a
No,
supporting
so
org.
they both confirmed. So they all done.
Awesome.
So those ones have been confirmed, and I assume that HealthLink, because they were I believe at the call, when we brought the previous version in. But yeah, I'll just get that confirmation in writing, and I'll probably do the same with Telstra Health. Again, Malcolm was here, but maybe I'll need to have something in writing.
All right, I think all of that's looking good. I think you've still got like draft ballot timeframe notes that I reckon you can just drop that.
That's going to go.
The rest of the form looks now filled out correctly, but I guess for the people on the line, there's a couple of people who didn't get the exposure of the earlier one. Can you just talk through, I guess, the projected scope and approach? And part of the approach that I would like to understand is how we're going to schedule that in with FHIR work group meetings or a separate kind of call, or what's the thought around all of that? Because all of the decision making will need to go through. Every time we make a decision, it's going to have to go through some committee vote. So I'd like to understand how we're going to resource it.
Yeah, so look, the idea is to run this through the FHIR work group and not have a separate stream of calls or meetings of its own, with the exception that you might have some information sessions and things like that. That I think we'll end up scheduling just to alleviate some of the pressure on the FHIR working group. So that's probably how I see this will work, and that means we'll probably just have to kind of work a bit more in tandem with everything else that's coming through the FHIR work group. So if anyone's got any concerns with that, just let us know. But that's what we were thinking of doing.
I think
initially,
that's totally feasible. Yeah. Could you just, again, for some of the other people on the line who haven't been at the previous presentation, could you do a quick run through of the projected scope of what the PD release is going to be?
Yeah. So look, at a very kind of basic level. So what we're proposing is mostly a like-for-like kind of approach, but refreshing what's currently the AUPD FHIR implementation guide to derive from Core. So at the moment, it doesn't derive from Core, and we would be looking at doing some work to just establish that linkage. But in doing that, I think there's an opportunity, and this is probably like for like plus. I think there's an opportunity for us to pursue specific discussions on matters that may be of interest to the community. We've been talking about endpoint. I think there's an opportunity here through this project for us to do more exploratory work around endpoint and how we might go about expanding our kind of knowledge and how we're representing endpoint to cover a wider variety of use cases. I think there's definitely the room for us to be doing that in here. So I would probably look at this as an opportunity, I guess, for us, if we have enough critical mass, to try to do some work that can then be leveraged by many others kind of downstream from us, if the community is interested in doing that. That was also something that I discussed with Brett at the Spark testing event last week. And yeah, I'll definitely be looking to leverage the community and the interest in this project to get that done. And other than that, as I said, look, it's mostly to try to reestablish this one as a current specification that directories in Australia can derive from, which would then, I guess, hopefully trigger some work outside of this project scope on things that would eventually come and derive from the specifications. I'm thinking that the agency's Health Connect Provider Directory, which we couldn't really derive from PD initially because PD wasn't in the state we could do it. But if we improve PD, then we could potentially come back and update our own agency specification to reflect a linkage to this one. But there will be future things. But that's how we're envisaging this, just bringing the specification to a state where it's, again, fit for purpose.
Thanks, Ricardo. We've got a question from Brett and then Danielle.
I just have some comments. There's a lot of stuff that needs to get reviewed, and I don't know how that's going to happen in a regular firework group setting, and timeframes. I would definitely advocate for having at least a sequence of specific project meetings to get through some of that. And I'm under the assumption, as Danielle's kind of mentioned, that like the actor definitions and capability statements, and all that work that went into HCA, obligations that went into HCA would be reflected back in the spec as well. Yep. And I think those, even the discussion today, those specific endpoint profiles would be very valuable. So I'd like to think we could get to at least doing via RESTful and a specific SMD endpoint profile would be excellent. I have a really like, because basically all the material in there and search parameter requirements and conformance and everything will need to get reviewed as part of this exercise. So that's a parameter by parameter requirement that would need to get confirmed. So yeah, I just think there's a lot of items. So whether that can happen in this group in a regular meeting, I think that's pretty tough.
Okay.
Brian has
Yeah.
just popped a comment in,
Yeah.
I guess about the additional sessions that you're proposing, Brett, saying whether or not they'd be just for discussions informing content rather than voting, and then bringing the voting to the core broader group,
I prefer,
Yeah, I
which
think
I
that's
think I
fair.
would generally advocate for. That's
Yeah.
what we've done with other new profiles.
not for patient, like patient summary ran its own projects, right, in core.
That's very true.
Yeah,
Are
and like they
you
just had the
True,
full
but we
force of
set that
them.
up very specifically that way, and I guess that's why we're asking the question as we come into
Yeah,
resourcing this on
yeah,
how do we support this project and make it happen? Yeah.
yeah. Like say we started this project in the next month, we're going to be in reconciliation, and stuff like that. So I just think I just think I mean we could begin on the premise that we're going to deal with it inside the work group, but I just there's a lot of material to cover.
Yeah, look, I have a
Is my
separate comment
thought.
or question, but Ruben's hands up and he may actually have a comment on this current discussion, in which case you go, Ruben.
I did have a different thing, but I'll comment on where we are going here. My gut tells me that, and this is obviously informed by years of working on directory IGs, international. I do think it's probably worth having a dedicated project level call for the development of this. Just noting, of course, that so much of our meetings are focused on AU-based related issues and other more general FHIR governance issues. So my vote would be, can we look at doing a project level call? But my separate comment was actually just on the project scope and need, but I'm happy to come back to that once we've landed on how we want to do the calls and resourcing afterward.
All right, back to you, Danielle.
So, I agree. If AU-based work dropped off, we would have space. It seems to, however, be that like the busiest project for like reasons, which are good. Um, so in terms of doing provider directory stuff, I think it's quite interesting. I think maybe a bunch of the firework group co-chairs should meet offline with the people who are tagged as being like the publishing facilitator, and not the publishing facilitator because that's Brett, but like the IG facilitator and so forth, to talk about some of this and how it gets brought through. This would be sitting under the firework group. We could have a separate call, and try to schedule some of that. I think a bunch of it is going to be, okay, hang on, let me rephrase. So, to my knowledge, quite a lot of it is intended to be like for like. But then I think there are also some aspects where we've understood some improvements over the years that we do not yet have a FHIR work group improvement, like agreement on, including out of what was the recent work that I think Rob Eastwood was doing, which was maybe a year ago. But anything that we want to backput from the Health Connect PCA work back into AUPD, and also understanding how does Core surface in that and what are the normative kind of changes look like. So I think we have a mix of things that are going to be, how do I take what is a narrative description of a capability statement? Because they're in AUPD. They're written in narrative, but they have to be transformed into a capability statement. And just getting like a review that this is exactly the same, yes, versus how do we make what are normative or substantive changes? So I think we could try to mix it up a bit because, frankly, if we're talking about having a work group meeting run over every single, like in a meeting call, run over every single change, we're going to run out of time. That's huge. We might try to find a way to async some of this from a review perspective. Um, I don't know if that would be comfortable for people where we just go, this is literally a conversion from this narrative description into like the computable artifact form and just get someone to review it and okay it. If no one has objections to that, we could try to fold that into the process, as well as then there's going to need to be, yeah, I think it is worth having a number of project meetings. This is going to be a bit awkward because Encounter Record wants to start up as well. So it's kind of like, how many meetings can we have in a week? I do like the idea that was floated that a lot of things are proposed and developed, but then brought through for voting into the firework group, which is potentially broader. I think that could be a way to mitigate some of the concerns. I don't know if other people are comfortable with that, but I really liked that idea.
Thanks, Danielle. Richard?
And thinking around the idea of, do we roll it into the existing set of meetings, or do we have it in its some other meetings for it? One of the benefits of having a different set of meetings is maybe we can then have people who don't have interest in the wider AU base work, just interested in this one, and we may, through that approach, get some targeted effort by people who are particularly interested in this particular one. And that might wind up making the extra workload easier to manage by having, without being extra work for everybody that's coming to this meeting.
Okay, thanks, Richard. That's a really valid point. We've got Brett with his hand up as well.
Oh, I think the issue with bringing it back is that we will have to bring context and re-prosecute discussions, and I think that's my concern, is that there's a lot of decisions to get made, and it's more just the ability for a project group to actually make the decisions. I mean, the thing's going to go ballot, right? So there'll be plenty of opportunity to have a say so. Um, um, yeah, so it's just more the logistics of that, because even if I bring through a complete answer, is that sufficient to sit there in a firework group and go, this is the answer? Can we vote on it? Because usually that's had some background that, we've come to some conclusion. Yeah, so it's just a question of how it's going to work, because it's yeah, but I think we could go either way. I don't mind that much, but it's yeah, but and to Richard's point a bit too, I think there are parties that are specifically interested in provider directory only. So to give them their own ability to get involved with the project and actually participate is helpful, because we're not asking them to sit for other business as well.
Thanks, Brett. We've also just had a comment from Danielle about suggesting a mailing list and then potentially bringing this to a connectathon at a future, a breakout at a future connectathon. Also pointing out that there is a dedicated Zulip channel. In the interest of time, we're got 13 minutes left in the call. Is there any further wrap-up discussion that we need on this item? Do we need to decide how we're doing
We need to
this?
vote
Yeah.
on approving
Yeah.
on approving the PSS so we can go to TSC if we're going to.
Yeah. Do we need to have any further discussion talking about the how it's going to be developed, like the ways of working, whether it becomes part of base or whether it's something, or is that something that can come after the project scope statement is approved?
I think that's something that can come after the project scope statement is approved. I think we all recognise it meets the criteria for this from a work group perspective, and we can discuss further on how we realise it. But I also note that Ruben has his hand up and
Yeah.
could have a salient comment.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I did flag this a couple of months ago when this project was first proposed, and that was making clear once this IG is published, what the community needs to make of it, especially considering the number of other in-play and very similar provider directory FHIR IGs we have, namely Health Direct and the Health Connect provider directory. I wasn't sure because I just glimpsed the PSS whether it talks about whether there's any thought on how people should transition, whether they should adopt this instead of the others, because there was a lot of feedback on the Health Connect project that people wanted it to be an open spec that they could implement independently of Health Connect. So that then raises the question if this is then an option as well. Is the message to the community, no, you should adopt this one, or in future, we will update Health Connect to adopt this one as well. I think we need to provide some clarity to the community on, what this means once it exists from an adoption perspective. And apologies if this was handled in a previous meeting. I'm not aware of it.
Wasn't.
Thanks, Ruben. That's really valid.
It is, and I believe part of now that we have a new template, kind of a HL7 AUIGs, I think the related specifications page is the kind of thing where we would expect that to surface, and I think that would be absolutely necessary, really, to describe that. So yeah, I think that's part of the uplift into getting into ballotable shape. Coming back to then Ricardo, in terms of resourcing. So if you're going for, so what was kind of put there was a March ballot. We would want to see this surfaced. We definitely need it in the December connectathon, right? Like refactored capability statements, actor definitions, like our set of draft profiles and all that kind of thing in the new shiny shape need to be up and running by December so that can have some of that testing out for AFMM1 before we go into ballot for March. Is that feasible?
That's what we're going to be aiming for. So yeah, I think we can't really predict how things may change for us, but right now I think it's visible. Yeah,
Cool.
if something else happens that will force us to shuffle priorities a little bit, we'll of course communicate in due course. But right now I think that's visible.
Right, that
Great.
sounds good. New AUPD and Encounter record will debut at the December Connectathon in Melbourne. It's going to be wild. We've got a lot of stuff to do. Sounds great.
Exciting times. So it seems like the conversation has come to a natural end. I'm happy to entertain a motion, Ricardo.
Sorry, Marika, do we want a resubmission of this copy once I had the chance to confirm with HealthLink and Telstra Health? Or
That's
are
a
you
question
happy
for
to?
Brett and Danielle. Are we happy
Do
to?
a
Let's just
conditional
put
approval?
conditional. Yeah, just do a conditional, and if you get there, nod, include them, and if you don't for the TSC. Yeah.
Okay, so what if I just right now then remove them, and I'll contact them, and
Yeah.
if they're interested, they're interested. If they're not, they're
Yeah.
not. So
That's it.
I think we will. I'll share this updated version. I'll remove Telstra Health and Health Link, but I will contact them by email just to confirm if I can put them back in. But that will be something for the future.
Yep. So I think it's still worthwhile in your motion saying
Yep.
I'll conditionally add them back in just so that that's voted on here and you don't have to create a whole
Yep.
new motion, context, discussion.
All right, so I'll put forward the motion now. So I'd like to submit a motion to the group that the PSS for the Provider Directory Implementation Guide project is approved. The PSS will include the changes as displayed at the meeting here, which factor in a publication on Q2 2027 and the ballot in March 2027. And also that I will, for the time being, remove both Telstra Health and Health Link from the list of interested parties, but I'll follow up with them in writing just to confirm that they're happy to be added back in. And if they are, then I'll add them back in accordingly.
Danielle, I'm
Great.
happy to second.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, Danielle. All right, let's go again. So you should have that poll there available to you. If you're unable to vote, please just pop it in the chat. All right, counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. We have 9, including Brett in the chat. Affirmative, negative is 0, and 1 abstention. Motion carries. So we're bringing forward the AUPD project scope statement. Thanks, Brian.
Okay.
Can I just check the abstention is what's in the chat? Because
no, so there's 1 abstention that I have as sorry. I thought that I shared. So we've just had, so it should be 9 affirmative, including what's in chat, 0 negative, and then 2 abstentions, including what's in chat.
perfect.
Okay. Thanks, Danielle. All right. We have got 6 minutes remaining. The next item, I'm not seeing anyone from Telstra, and it sounds like we're not hearing from Angus today.
Angus didn't reply to me. I did DM him, so
We'll see
I
what that
think
means
we'll
for
handle it in
future.
ballot, is my expectation.
Perfect. That sounds reasonable. Danielle or Brett, can I throw to you quickly for timelines for AU Base R7? And then we've got...
Yes? Do
Thankfully,
you want me to
there's no
share
more
my
decisions to
screen?
make.
That would be wonderful.
So first question, okay, so here's where we are now,
Can you
right?
share your screen, Danielle?
Yeah, I'm about to, and I'm not about to actually share the where are we now, because I only do the fancy slides for Sparked. So now that we've hit AFMM1 for what were all the new artifacts that were on discussion, um, although we have a couple of ongoing topics that Angus and Heath are potentially working through, we've had previous discussions about handling those as needed during ballot. So I guess the question here that I'll just throw to peeps is, are we happy to proceed into ballot for AU Base at this point? Are there any concerns or objections or anything that people want to walk through? I can kind of bring up the GitHub slate, yet less useful. Let's do the actual CI build on the kind of changes that we have brought through, noting a couple we've put in. So we've done across this release, we've done a substantive amount of changes to the identifiers, and got a different approach that we've defined here. And those have flowed through then to all the downstream specs. So Core, when balloted, will pick up all of this. We've got a new endpoint profile, which is really the only new resource profile. We've got new HAE, HSPO. We've got the endpoint code systems, endpoint value sets have been done there. And then we've put in some changes around how we do no known meds here. Noting that one of the change requests is going to come into ballot because the shift in Australia has been to use a particular no known meds concept that is replacing what was an Australian specific one. There's one other place it surfaces in AU Base. I've agreed to raise that as an action on me and ballot, so we'll just clean it up before we publish. But otherwise, these are essentially the changes that we've worked through, including the service provision conditions, concept changes. Which are normative. They're replacing a whole bunch of stuff that we actually had. So this is where we've landed. We've deferred a bunch of other things, but I'll put that to the group. Are we happy to proceed into ballot? Is there anything else that people want to raise that we need to address prior to going into ballot? Not hearing anything or seeing any hands, I'd like to treat this as by general consensus, we agree we're happy to proceed into ballot. I don't think we need to call out for any motioning or otherwise.
Happy with that.
All right, cool. So let's ballot. Now let's talk timeframes. Righty-o. So a ballot sign up is open. It closes here on the 29th, which is also, well, the 28th is the date we're going to publish the AU Base snapshot. So the IG authoring team, which is Brett, has until the 28th, plus like help from the agency and a couple of peeps from Sparked, to get all of that through as much as we can. Core will be published on the 29th, and then ballot opens here. We've given there's a bit of a delay there because of loading up the list of people who've signed up to ballot into the HL7 international tooling and getting that all correctly. So that's why we've got that little bit of a gap. And then ballot sign up opens here. And then voting will happen in this period of time where we also have coming into what is, and I'll just scroll down a bit. We have our connectathon, which is an insipid color. Who keeps changing all the colors in our international like calendars? Every few months, all the colors
Yeah, that went
change.
weird.
Fine. So the connectathon is now this insipid sort of blue color. Um, we will be testing almost all of the changes actually, because most of those affect core. So AU core is going to get a bunch of detailed testing here, which will also test out the base stuff. And there'll be connected care and all those other things that we were talking about. We've also teed up two breakouts from the FHIR work group. Actually, we might even have three that are related to diagnostic report terminology and also the handling of medication dispense workflow and workflow terminology that Heath is managing through some of the work with Fred IT and Telstra Health to come through in that connectathon, which may or may not result in ballot items, because the reason we're having the connectathon is ballot period is open, so we can actually generate any changes we think we need there. So at that point, ballot sign up will be closed, and we need to complete reconciliation within 2 months. I'm going to stop sharing now. So by the end of August, we need to have completed all our reconciliation, as will AU Core, come in and do an item into testing out that reconciled snapshot in the December connectathon, along with what's new around encounter record and PD. And then we will publish in probably early Jan. That's the goal for base. Questions?
Not hearing any. That sounds really great. Did you have
Awesome.
anything final to add, Danielle? Just conscious of time.
No, I mean, I think that's it. We can all be prepped for there'll be ballot reconciliation period coming through, and that's what the focus is really going to be. So, yeah, that's it.
Wonderful. Awesome. So next meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks. So the 29th of July. How is it almost end of July? Thanks, Ruben. Last
Sorry,
question.
I realize we are a bit over time, but I wanted to add this right at the end for anyone who's interested. The next ballot of HL7 FHIR R6 is commencing later this week, as is HL7 Australia's way. Brett and I at a minimum register in that ballot as some of the sort of members with votes who can represent the whole of HL7 Australia. So if anyone's interested in adding voting of ballot comments in that ballot, just create the Jira tracker item and let Brett and I know, and we can turn it into an official vote, affirmative, negative question or comment. That way, HL7 Australia as an affiliate can participate in that ballot if anyone is so inclined. You can reach out to me outside of this meeting as well if you need more information on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. Last one, Danielle, and then I'll have to close the
Just
meeting.
confirming about the scope of that. So in terms of fire standard, and I know a bunch of stuff is now moved out to, what are we calling the adjacent space?
Incubators.
Incubators, right, yes. So stuff that's not normative, is that correct, is moved out to incubators?
Yeah. So all that remains is normative and informative content.
Yep. And are they on their own timeline? Or do they go at the same time?
They're on their own timeline.
Okay. And then extensions pack is also on a separate timeline?
Yep.
Okay, cool. No, I just want to check that about like the scope of the things that I would raise. Thank you.
Sure.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ruben. Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, everyone, for your participation today. We look forward to hopefully seeing you in 2 weeks' time.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Marika.
Thanks, guys.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marika.